Chainsaws ripped through the grove before anyone was awake, trunks toppling like fallen soldiers. I ran through the mud, sawdust choking the air, as the trees my father had planted for decades crashed to the ground. 39 of them. Gone. And there she was, Karen Riley, HOA president, leaning against her porch, railing pink fleece, glowing in the weak sunlight, clipboard in hand, sipping her cocoa like she'd just orchestrated a symphony of destruction. "They're HOA property now," she said, smiling. "They're mine," I said, voice trembling. She chuckled. By the time I realized what she'd done, something else had shifted, and I knew this wasn't over. Karen Riley didn't just oversee the destruction, she orchestrated it. From the edge of the grove, clipboard in hand, she stood like a queen, surveying conquered territory. Pink fleece blazing in the cold winter sun, thermos of cocoa steaming beside her, she radiated a quiet, dangerous confidence. Every step she took was deliberate, every glance calculated. The defining moment was when I confronted her about the trees. She tilted her head a slow practice gesture and drew out the word HOA managed. Calm as reading a grocery list, she dismissed decades of my family's legacy with a shrug. That small, measured smirk wasn't just arrogance, it was control. She liked bending rules to her will, and the more helpless her target, the better. Her obsession was clear. Anyone who ignored her authority, anyone who refused to bend, became a problem to be corrected. And I was the perfect target, quiet, private, seemingly compliant until now. Early tension had already been building. Notices, boundary letters, harmless inspections, all subtle attempts to push me into line. But when those chainsaws roared, it was the first overt act of domination, her power exposed in neon orange vests and falling timber. Karen's motive was simple: control, profit, and the thrill of bending neighbors to her vision of the perfect community. Every calculated smile, every passive-aggressive email, every letter threatening fines was her way of proving she could and would rule unchecked. And she hadn't expected me to fight back. I grew up in that pine grove long before Pinebrook Estates existed. I was 5, bundled in a wool scarf that scratched my neck, riding high on my father's shoulders while he pointed at the tallest tree in our grove. That one sun, that one we planted the year you were born. Every December after that, we walked the same narrow trail behind our old cabin, selected a single tree with quiet ceremony, cut it with care, and dragged it home like a trophy. These weren't just trees, they were memory, continuity, legacy. After Dad passed in 2016, I inherited the 5-acre tract, a long rectangle of pines that had stood since the early 72nds. The neighborhood around us changed dramatically. New streets, identical mailboxes, glossy street signs, faux luxury villas, and with them came Pinebrook Estates HOA, spreading its influence like ivy. They painted every curb, the same gray installed standard street lamps, and whispered compliance like a prayer. But our grove and cabin were untouched outside the HOA's recorded boundaries, sacred and private. Some winters we didn't cut a single tree. Sophie, my 8-year-old daughter, called it the quiet forest. She swore the trees listened when she whispered secrets. For years, the grove was a sanctuary, a place where my family's past and my daughter's imagination could coexist. The first cracks were subtle. Letters arrived about boundary adjustments, community beautification, and compliance with updated guidelines. Contractors appeared, sometimes lingering, sometimes watching their trucks with out-of-state plates sitting where they had no right. They looked ordinary, but there was a quiet menace behind every clipboard and every polite nod. By December, I felt it like a storm before the thunder. The air was too warm, the sky too white, and there were far too many unfamiliar vehicles lining Pinebrook Drive. And then the roar started. Chainsaws, trunks falling like artillery shells. My grove, my father's legacy, and my daughter's memories, all under attack. And standing at the edge of it, clipboard in hand, pink fleece bright against the pale winter sun, was Karen Riley, the HOA president. Smiling, calm, watching, waiting. I realized then that the quiet encroachment had become something far more deliberate. This wasn't about rules, it was about power. And that was the moment I understood the war had already begun. It began subtly. A letter slipped under the cabin door, neatly typed warning about boundary adjustments and community compliance. I dismissed it at first. Then came the trucks. Shiny pickups, unmarked vans, men in fluorescent vests, standing at the grove edge, snapping photos, measuring, whispering about scheduled inspections. I watched from the porch, Sophie clutching my hand. The familiar quiet of the forest felt invaded every shadow, heavy with intent. Karen Riley appeared on the far street corner, clipboard in hand, pink fleece bright against the muted morning, smiling faintly as if she were watching a play unfold. Her gaze lingered long enough to make me uneasy. It wasn't just observation, it was intimidation, a test of my boundaries. Each subtle intrusion, letters, inspections, men lingering on property, was calculated. Karen wanted to see if I'd bend, retreat, or comply. Something in me stiffened. I realized then that what started as passive harassment was deliberate, and someone had marked my property and my family legacy as theirs. It was a gray morning when I first saw them crossing the line. 3 men in neon vests stepped onto my property, snapping photos, stretching tape measures across the trunks, whispering among themselves. I shouted, "Get off my land." One looked at me like I was a nuisance. "Talk to Karen," he barked. I stormed up the trail to her porch. Pink fleece jacket blazing, clipboard in hand, she tilted her head, calm, calculated. "Scheduled removal," she said, voice smooth as silk. No permits, no county approval, just her assumed authority. She rattled off covenants I had never signed, guidelines I had never agreed to. It wasn't enforcement, it was assertion. Each step, each glance, each paper slipped under the door was a calculated move to intimidate. She wanted to see if I would comply, retreat, or submit. Her motive was obvious: control and profit. I wasn't just a neighbor, I was an obstacle. And Karen Riley had no intention of losing. December 5th arrived wrong. The air was too warm, the sky too white, and then came the roar, chainsaws screaming through the grove like artillery fire. I sprinted down the muddy trail. 39 pines, decades old, my father's legacy, split and crashed to the ground, sawdust flying like dirty snow. Sophie appeared behind me, clutching my arm, eyes wide. "They cut Grandpa's tree." Her voice broke something inside me I hadn't felt in years. Karen stood at the grove's edge, clipboard in hand, sipping cocoa, smiling like a conductor watching her orchestra. Every cut was a message: your past, your memories, your family's history, gone. The mini-twist came when I noticed the men weren't even local contractors. No permits, no licenses, just subcontractors untraceable, following Karen's orders. The damage wasn't just emotional, it was financial. These trees represented thousands of dollars, yet the real cost was far higher: the destruction of legacy, continuity, and memory. That night I dug through deeds, plants, surveys. The grove had never been HOA property. Karen hadn't just overstepped. She had committed theft, trespass, and destruction on a scale I hadn't expected. I called the sheriff's non-emergency line, hoping for some measure of authority. "Civil matter," the deputy said flatly. "We can't intervene without documentation." My hands shook as I explained the deeds, the plats, the surveys. He sighed, sympathetic but bound by procedure. Without the paperwork in front of him, the law couldn't touch Karen's men. The next day, the contractors returned. No permits, no county tags, still under Karen's supervision. I documented everything: photographs, videos, GPS coordinates, notes of every violation, every act of trespass. Every letter threatening fines or legal action became evidence, a record of deliberate intimidation. By now it was clear that Karen wasn't just testing boundaries. She was confident she could manipulate the system. Her calm, controlled demeanor, clipboard in hand, watching from the edge of the grove, was infuriating. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her authority was assumed, and everyone else, including the deputies, played along. I realized the scale of the pattern. This wasn't just about one property, one grove. It was about asserting power, controlling neighbors, and hiding behind bureaucracy. For the first time, I understood the legal battle wouldn't be simple. I had to gather every scrap of proof, every historical record, to fight not just for the grove, but for the principle that no one could steal memories without consequence. 3 days later, I arrived at the grove to find the sentinel, the tallest pine planted the year I was born, gone. A jagged stump remained, tire tracks scarring the mud around it. A laminated notice flapped in the wind: emergency vegetation removal, safety hazard mitigation. Article 14, Section C, authorized by HOA. Sophie dropped her backpack and ran to me, sobbing. They took the last one. Her voice cracked, tiny and fragile, but it shattered something deep inside me. I held her close, feeling a cold, sharp fire ignite, a controlled, patient fury I hadn't felt in years. I whispered low and steady, "Now they've made it personal." I spent hours going through deeds, plats, and surveys, cross-referencing every line, every signature. The grove had never been HOA property. Karen had acted without notice, without permission, and without authority. The destruction wasn't just theft, it was deliberate, calculated, and personal. By sunset, I realized the quiet encroachment had escalated into an open war. Karen Riley had lit the fuse, confident I would remain silent. But I had proof, history, and law on my side, and something else had awakened: an unshakable resolve. She hadn't counted on what happens when a man who has protected his family's legacy for decades decides to fight back with everything he has. The Sentinel was gone, but the war had only just begun. The courthouse smelled of polished wood and anxious coffee. Reporters milled around cameras trained on the gallery. Karen Riley arrived, late clipboard, clutched like armor lawyer at her side, face taut and calculated. I carried 2 thick folders, the deeds, plats, surveys, and Sophie's red ribbon, and walked to the microphone with steady steps. Some of you know me as the quiet neighbor who never attended block parties. I began, voice calm but firm. I'm David Milner. My father owned this grove for decades. These trees, 39 of them, were cut down without notice, without jurisdiction, and without consent. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Karen leaned back as if this was still a matter of procedure, but I could see the first flicker of unease in her eyes. I laid Sophie's ribbon and a Polaroid of my father, me as a boy, and the Sentinel on the table. This isn't just about trees. It's about legacy memory and the principle that no one can steal what isn't theirs. The judge raised her eyebrows, scanning Karen before settling her gaze on me. Continue, Mr. Milner. I opened the first folder, the original Deeds Platts County surveys. Every page is meticulously cross-referenced. The Pinebrook Estates HOA had no legal claim, I said, voice rising slightly. The property remains outside their boundaries. No annexation, no recorded vote, no authority. Next, I laid out the second folder, HOA notices, flyers labeling me unstable records of subcontractors, removing the trees and the ledger, showing the sale of timber for profit. Each document landed like a hammer on the courtroom. The room grew silent, the weight of evidence pressing on every observer. Karen's lawyer whispered under his breath, trying to spin good faith misunderstanding. I ignored him. The facts were undeniable: trespass, property conversion, and deliberate emotional harm. I pointed to the photos of contractors, no permits, no badges, and the torn stumps still stained with sap. They acted on assumption, on greed, and on the belief that I would stay silent. But the community, the law, and the truth say otherwise. Neighbors in the gallery leaned forward, some whispering, some nodding. The judge's eyes narrowed, scanning each piece of evidence, then back at Karen. Her smile faltered. For the first time, she looked uncertain. The judge spoke, her voice calm but absolute. Pinebrook HOA is liable for trespass, conversion, and destruction of private property. Immediate injunction prohibits further action on non-HOA land. Compensatory and punitive damages to be determined at trial. Referral to the district attorney for potential criminal action is authorized. Karen didn't flinch, didn't speak, just stared at the table as if the wood itself had betrayed her. Her lawyer shifted uneasily, muttering under his breath. The tension was electric, a courtroom suspended between relief and reckoning. I gathered Sophie's ribbon, still bright despite 3 years, and the Polaroid, feeling the weight of every fallen tree, every memory destroyed, now balanced by justice. The gallery erupted in quiet murmurs, sympathetic nods, and restrained applause. My neighbor's eyes met mine with understanding. We had won the first battle. Karen finally turned and walked away, stiff, silent, a defeated monarch, leaving a kingdom she never truly ruled. The law had spoken. The truth was loud, irrefutable, and irreversible. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and neighbors crowded to congratulate us. Sophie squeezed my hand, eyes wide. "Did we win, Dad?" "We won the first battle," I said. "The war isn't over, but today the truth got very loud." And in that moment, standing among friends, strangers, and the echoes of my father's legacy, I knew the grove and everything it stood for would be protected. Back at the cabin, Sophie and I walked the trail together, past stumps and mud where the grove had been torn apart. The air smelled faintly of pine, tinged with cold winter earth. She held my hand tightly, red ribbon in hers, and I felt the weight of everything that had happened: the loss, the anger, the months of preparation, the quiet victories hidden behind paperwork and deeds. Neighbors began trickling in over the next week. One brought cookies, another a thermos of cocoa. Darren Fox, who had once apologized for his silence, showed up with gloves and a shovel. We started planting new saplings together, 20, then 40. The grove wasn't just ours anymore, it was ours with the neighborhood. Sophie tied a ribbon to each new tree, teaching every child who visited to do the same. The energy shifted. Where fear and intimidation had ruled, community respect and laughter began to take root. People who had never spoken before approached me to thank me, to share their own stories of small abuses by the HOA. Every planted tree became a symbol of resilience, a quiet rebellion against greed and bullying, a promise that memory would not be stolen again. Marshall filed the amended complaint with every piece of evidence I had gathered: deeds, plats, surveys, HOA correspondence, and photos of the contractors cutting my trees. The documents made the case undeniable. Within hours, subpoenas went out to the HOA office demanding every landscaping contract, timber, sale record, and internal memo related to my parcel. Boone Tree Services was suddenly under investigation for operating without insurance or permits. Karen Riley's carefully constructed world started to crack. Court rulings confirmed my ownership beyond dispute. Compensatory and punitive damages were awarded, along with full restitution for the destroyed property and legal fees. The judge issued an injunction barring any future actions on non-HOA land without verified consent from the recorded owner. The HOA board, blindsided by the evidence and public scrutiny, resigned en masse. A temporary steering committee, made up of neighbors without ties to the old regime, took control. The organization was forced to restructure its procedures, implement transparency measures, and remove members who had authorized overreach. Every ruling, every order, every correction felt like planting another seed of justice. Karen's attempts at retaliation, flyers warning of unstable homeowners, false citations, and threats were documented and dismissed. The law had finally sided with evidence, history, and principle. No family legacy, no private property could be stolen without consequence. The slow grind of justice had turned the tide, and I finally felt the first real relief in months. Spring arrived, and the saplings began to grow. Sophie and I walked the trail daily, watering, checking on each young pine, tying ribbons, whispering secrets. By mid-March, the 40 young trees had doubled in height, their needles thick and dark, promising shade and life. The Sentinel Jr., once a replacement for the stolen tree, now stood taller than Sophie herself. Word spread beyond the county. Visitors came quietly, leaving ribbons pressed, flowers, and handwritten notes. Donations arrived for scholarships in Sophie's name, teaching other children that standing up for what is right mattered. Karen's house went dark, eventually sold, and her name faded from local conversation. The Milner Clause, enshrining property protection, became law in the state and inspired similar legislation nationwide. Years later, Sophie led tours for school groups and lawmakers, telling each tree's story. The grove became a living memorial to courage, legacy, and community. And each Christmas, the first ribbon tied around Sentinel Jr. reminded us that the best revenge isn't destruction. It's creating something so alive, so vibrant, it can never be taken away. Sophie leaned against my shoulder one cold December evening, watching the solar lights flicker across the grove. "Dad, did Grandpa see us win?" I smiled, heart full. "He did, and he's proud." The lights glimmered, the ribbons fluttered, and the grove whispered its quiet truth roots. Remember, justice grows, and love endures. One tree, one ribbon, one stubborn heart at a time.